We live in a world of unending toxicity. Inflammation is the body's natural response to these assaults. It's innate self-defense mechanism that, when overstimulated, can escalate into a storm of self-destruction. Brain inflammation has been linked to autism for over a decade, and it is increasingly linked to ADHD. Neurosurgeon of decades' experience, Dr. Russell Blaylock returns for part 2 of Autism, ADHD, and diffusing inflammation. What exactly is in our food, our injections, our air that could be fueling the rise in autism and ADHD? How do we source non-toxic varieties of foods like bread and meat? And what steps to take to preserve brain health at the earliest phases of life? Dr. Blaylock is editor of the Blaylock Wellness Report, which highlights the right nutrition and other modes for improving health and preventing disease. Welcome to Vital Signs, where we learn how to get healthier from all angles, from the biochemical and nutritional to the things we do that nourish our minds and our souls. I'm Brendan Fallon. It's fantastic to have you back on Vital Signs again, Dr. Blaylock.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Earlier when we were talking, you were saying that when anywhere in the body becomes inflamed, the brain instantly becomes inflamed, and that these microglial immune cells release glutamate that, if it gets outside the cell, can damage the brain. And I know that certain foods can contribute glutamate directly to the body. And this made me think of bread, because I know that some people are hypersensitive to the gliadin, which is part of the gluten in bread. Hence, people have celiac disease and things like that. So where does bread in itself fit into this toxicity risk?
Well, even the natural is dangerous, but what people don't know is that 13% of the gluten comes from China. And they found that gluten is contaminated, that it contains what's called melamine. And melamine raises the protein content, and it's used in making plastic. It caused us a real scare one time. They were putting melamine in dog food that they were getting from China, or the ingredients, and it killed a lot of pets. It causes brain damage as well. And so that gluten that they add to wheat, they add to bread, they add to biscuits, they add to cakes, is very dangerous beyond the gluten, because it's contaminated with this toxic substance called melamine. The gluten itself is mostly made up of glutamate. And so that makes it dangerous by itself. And the fact they're putting more glutamate than is natural in bread. So if you make your own bread and you don't add glutamate to it, gluten to it, then it's safer. So you want to avoid processed foods. And they've looked at cancer, and most cancer is caused by processed foods. It's not organic foods or natural foods. It's when they've been processed. And it's the chemicals they're adding to the food that's producing the chronic disease that RFK is talking about, is that these additives are producing cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, diseases of the liver, the intestines, the heart. It's causing a lot of diseases. So these children they've looked at, and they said if they're consuming processed foods, they have up to 3 different markers for heart disease elevated. And they're getting elevation of things we know that cause cancer. So these additives they're putting in the food, and if you look at the additives on the label, it looks like a chemistry set. I mean, a lot of the names you can't pronounce. They make up names. And these are very harmful chemicals. And in combination, you have to realize the FDA does not test chemicals in combination. And so you have these combinations, and we don't know, well, are they synergistically toxic? Are they acting together to produce toxicity? Well, we don't know, because the FDA doesn't test them. And if we look at children that consume these processed foods versus organic pure foods, there's a tremendous difference in their health. I wrote an article with an immunologist in which we looked at vaccines, childhood vaccine, in which we compared the chronic health of unvaccinated kids to vaccinated. The unvaccinated kids were far healthier, and the vaccinated kids had chronic health conditions and were seen for a long time, all their life, for these induced diseases. Things that you wouldn't even suspect, for instance, problems with their blood sugar control, diabetes, type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, asthma. There's been over a 200% increase in asthma. There's been a 400% increase in obesity. And we know that asthma, number one, is exposure to glutamate. Even a government study, that was the one they said you can't question. And when I interviewed and visited the laboratory of Dr. Olney, who discovered excitotoxicity, he said, we found that if you fed the rats this when they were young, they become grossly obese. And then we found out that it was destroying parts of the brain that controls your obesity, your fat consumption, and fat deposition.
This is glutamate.
Glutamate. And so I told him long ago, I said, I think that this obesity epidemic we're seeing is because of glutamate in the food of these children when they're small. And they're eating junk food. You look at the food, for instance, they love chicken tenders. They don't realize that chicken tenders are made of the meat that falls on the floor of the processing company. They can't sell it, so they fry it to hide the slime and the smell, and they sell it as chicken tenders. So your child's eating garbage meat. There was a study, an expose that came out in a journal which demonstrated what the children were being fed in school lunch programs. And they found out red dye, number 5, was being put in the meat to make it look red and look healthy. And they found out a lot of the foods were adulterated, and even some of the foods were smell so bad, these companies would marinate it or fry it to cover up the smell, and they would soak it in Clorox. So they said a lot of this food was, you couldn't stand it until they cooked it to cover this up, and these children are eating it. Well, I'm not surprised they're chronically ill. They begin eating these garbage meals for years.
I've heard of these similar practices happening in the wet markets in China. This was being reported at the time of the pandemic. It's shocking to hear that there's similar practices have been happening in America.
Yeah, it's been happening for years. And these school lunch programs, they're feeding them literal garbage, things you would throw away. And they cover it up by frying it or soaking in chlorine or some other method, marinating it, so these kids don't realize they're eating this garbage meat. And then they looked at the IQ. I met the researcher that actually did it, and they looked at the IQ in children who eat healthy diets versus this junk food, and the IQ was far higher in the healthy diet. The mother would prepare the food themselves, and then they would eat it. Even taking a single multivitamin drastically increased their IQ and their ability to learn in school.
Many of the examples you've given there are of processed food, like the chicken tenders. I think many parents probably understand there's a danger with processed foods, but perhaps they're uncertain of what exactly is a processed food. Maybe there's things they're feeding their kids that they don't consider to be processed. It's not McDonald's or it's not microwave oven meal, but how do you define that, Dr. Blaylock? What do you define as a processed food?
Well, they add chemicals to it. Basically, it's not something that's found in nature. You don't slaughter an animal and then eat the meat as it came naturally. You don't take vegetables and consume the vegetables as they're grown naturally. What you do is you add chemicals to them. You put them in a can, and like I said, if you look at the label, it looks like a chemistry set. And the meat's injected. A lot of meats have injected hydrolyzed protein. Well, that's just a form of glutamate. And so we see these things that are processed in a company, in a facility, are not natural. They're not found in nature. They're not grown in a garden naturally. They have all these chemicals added to them. And that's what's producing the disease and the cancer rate. Cancer rates have just gone out of the roof since these things have been used.
I'm interested to know what you eat, Dr. Blaylock. For one, in terms of meat, how do you find meat that isn't toxic? How do you deal with this in your own household, your own family?
Well, generally you buy it from local farmers. That's what we do. We buy local meat that's not processed. They don't add things to it. I mean, things like bacon has nitrates added to it, and the nitrate produce are integral to the excitotoxic process, and they cause all kinds of problems. You look at some of these processed meats that come in a package that are these sliced meats. Well, they've got all kinds of chemicals added to them. So what you want to do is eat completely natural meat with the nutrients been added to. Even if it's in a supermarket, you buy the fresh meat.
Okay, go to the butcher, I guess.
Yeah, go to a butcher or the butcher shop in the supermarket, and it has nothing added to it. It's just the meat itself.
Just now, Dr. Blaylock, you were talking about how hydrolyzed protein, which is put into a lot of meats, is itself a form of glutamate. This is an example of glutamate in a food directly contributed to the body. But I know that also there's the situation where if the body becomes inflamed, say through a toxic substance, the brain becomes inflamed and the microglial immune cells release their own glutamate. And if that gets outside the cells, then that can do damage to brain cells. And this is immunoexcitotoxicity, this term that you've coined. I'm wondering how this relates to the kinds of behaviors we see with autism, like the isolating behaviors, the erratic behavior, the lack of cognitive ability. How are these things linked?
You can produce every one of them. It's the number one neurotransmitter in your brain is glutamate. It's the thing that keeps you awake. But it has to be very, very carefully regulated because it's so toxic. And in autism, you have a far excess of glutamate in the brain. And so it disturbs the physiology of the brain and eventually the pathology of the brain and the development of the brain. It's that important of a neurotransmitter. It regulates all the other neurotransmitters. And so we have one of the most important neurotransmitters in the brain being seriously altered in autism, which produces these strange behaviors that we're seeing. And what they found in the children that have autism, and I said this years ago, is that the glutamate level was much higher in them. And they just recently discovered that. I said that the microglia were activated. They just did the microglial scanning on autistic children. They found that widespread microglial activation. So all the different components that I described over 21 years ago have now been shown. And so we know that the brain has very high glutamate levels and is producing disruption of the brain's normal function, which we see as all these abnormal behaviors.
I see that coming through a lot nowadays, Dr. Blaylock, this understanding of microglial activation in autism. Given this can also be a factor with attention hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, what accounts for the different set of behaviors, the different set of symptoms with ADHD as compared to autism, where you may not have such a cognitive impairment, but you might have antisocial behavior that in that situation, why would we see a difference, though we have a common cause with these situations?
Well, it's affecting different parts of the brain and different intensities. And if we look at some of these disorders that we're talking about, if it's milder amount, if it's a lower amount of glutamate, then you get ADHD. If you get really high amount that's affecting the brain universally, then you get autism. We saw this with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and ALS, is that people who were exposed to this toxin, if they got a small amount of the toxin, they produce Alzheimer's, and if they got another dose, they got Parkinson's, and they got another dose, they got ALS. So with the same chemical, depending on the concentration and what part of the brain was affected, you had a completely different neurological picture.
This reminded me of something I saw in your paper around the brain inflammation, the glutamate interfering with the dopamine levels in the brain, as I understand it. And I'm wondering if this could be a factor in ADHD symptoms, because I know that ADHD has a dopamine factor as well.
Well, the connection to a psychiatric disease And the connection to Parkinson's disease is quite similar. For instance, the brain produces dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter. That is, it communicates between the cells of the brain. It has to do with your reward system. So if you got a lot of dopamine, then things seem rewarding. It seems to be give you a sense of comfort. If you don't have the dopamine, then you have a lot of anxiety, a lot of problems. And this is what happens with ADHD and autism and some of these other problems. And also we see in Parkinson's disease, because the dopamine's so low, they have similar problems. And so we've shown that the part of the brain affected in Parkinson's disease has the largest number of microglia of the entire brain. The second largest is in the hippocampus of the brain, which has to do with memory. And so you've got two very important areas of the brain which are affected by inflammation anywhere in your body. So if you stimulate the inflammation in the body or have chronic inflammation in your body, you have chronic inflammation in your brain, you have lower dopamine, you have more psychiatric problems connected with it, and that's the connection. We've also found that addiction has to do a lot with excitotoxicity, and that if you increase the excitotoxicity in the brain, they're highly addicted. If you block it, they're not addicted at all. So it's beginning to look like a lot of things that are going on in the brain have to do with excitotoxicity.
So this would suggest an interplay between the excess glutamate, the immunoexcitotoxicity in the brain, and the dopamine channels.
Right, yeah. It can burn out the dopamine channels. If it's high enough glutamate, it'll destroy the cells that release dopamine, and otherwise it can just reduce the amount of dopamine that's released. So we see a connection between inflammation and these effects on dopamine, which also has an effect of neuropsychiatric diseases.
In just a moment, we'll hear how a mother's inflammatory condition during pregnancy could impact her offspring later in life. But first, on the topic of countering inflammation, earlier, integrative psychiatrist Dr. Jingduan Yang highlighted the brain health benefits of supernutrient nicotinamide mononucleotide, or NMN.
I have tried NMN on a few patients who basically reporting following benefits. One is they do feel better, improve the short-term memory, as well as ability to concentrate. Number two, they do report improve the energy levels because fatigue has been very prevalent in our patients' population. Improving their energy is a very important part of our therapy.
Afterward, find the link to that video at the top of the comments and also in this video's description below. And to get notice of new Vital Signs videos, follow me at Vital Signs Brendan on Instagram and Facebook, and at C Vital Signs on X. Dr. Blaylock, we've talked a lot about the impact of this excess glutamate on the brain, so it didn't surprise me to see in your paper you talk about these drugs that are glutamate blockers showing positive results for schizophrenia patients. Then you go on to say that more attention should be given to this side, looking at the glutamate, than the attention to the neurotransmitters like dopamine, which a lot of the drugs I know, like antipsychotics, focus on for treating these conditions. Would this translate across to autism and ADHD as well, your recommendation to focus more on the glutamate factor to relieve symptoms?
Yeah, basically what you're looking at is they're looking at the neurotransmitter, the dopamine, the norepinephrine, the other thing, the serotonin in the brain. And they're not under the knowledge that all of these neurotransmitters are controlled by glutamate. We have glutamate transmitters that control the GABA transmitters. We have glutamate transmitters that control serotonin and dopamine. And so the approach should change. It should be a way to reduce the inflammation, which is triggering the excitotoxicity, rather than just concentrating on the neurotransmitters themselves. Because otherwise you're not really stopping the mechanism. You're out in the fringes.
Well, basically, you'd just be treating the symptoms.
Right, right.
Another point that stood out to me in your paper, Dr. Blaylock, you were talking about how a pregnant woman, if she suffers an infection, this could lead to the inflammation that may contribute to autism or schizophrenia later in life. I'm wondering what this suggests about a prevention strategy then in preventing these kinds of diseases.
Yeah, there's some interesting research in which they took some animals and they just use immune stimulation, no infectious agent. And they increased the amount of TNF-alpha and interleukin-1 beta and interleukin-6. And they found out after birth, or the offspring behaved like a schizophrenic or had other neuropsychiatric problems. They acted like autistic kids. And so what they found out was that the closest link was interleukin-6, which is an inflammatory cytokine. And that if the mother's infected, she has a virus or some other problem during her latter parts of her pregnancy, then that alters the brain formation in that child, so the child is born with this problem. But it didn't have to do with the infection itself. It had to do with immune stimulation. And that's what they did in the research. They just stimulated the immune system, and they didn't use an infectious agent. Well, this is why forever you never vaccinated a pregnant woman, because it would be high incidence of abortion, of spontaneous abortion.
This would activate the immune system by
vaccination. Right, it activates the immune system. And there was a high incidence of schizophrenia in the offspring, which was later in life. Usually at adolescence is when they showed the signs of autism. Schizophrenia. And the autism is about 3 or 4 to 6 years old. So if you stimulate the immune system while the pregnancy's in this last trimester, you have a high incidence of these outcomes, either schizophrenia or autism. And if you stimulate the immune system early after birth, during that first year of birth, the same thing's going to happen, because the brain's undergoing intense formation at that stage. Like I said, 2 years after birth, the brain undergoes most of its formation, that last trimester in the first 2 years. And we found that the frontal parts of the brain continue to form even up to age 26 and 27. So if you're continuing to stimulate the immune system later in life, even during adolescence or the early years of life, it's going to interfere with the formation of frontal lobes. Well, the frontal lobes are very important in brain function, particularly in controlling your behavior.
And if you're getting that kind of interference to the formation of the frontal lobes, that would explain the kinds of behavioral symptoms you see with schizophrenia, with autism, with ADHD.
Exactly. And we can reproduce that experimentally, just using immune stimulation, not an infectious agent.
So one takeaway, I guess, if a child is going to be vaccinated, if the parents have made that decision, to delay it to the greatest degree possible.
Well, at least till after the brain has had its major formation. I mean, 90% of the brain is formed within that first 2 years after birth. So you want to delay it, and there's another process called priming. And what happens with microglia and all immune cells is if you stimulate them, they gear up all their enzymes to produce these inflammatory chemicals, but they don't release them. And then if you wait a week or a couple of weeks or a month later and you stimulate them again, it further increases the production of these chemicals, but they're not released until about the third time. And then you start at that third or fourth injection or stimulation of the immune system, then it'll release them, and they're 3 times higher than normal. Yeah, they're 3 times higher than normal.
Right.
And so you get tremendous destruction of the brain and interference with its formation.
With vaccination aside, I guess there's still the danger of infection of a woman, say with COVID, for example, getting an infection during pregnancy. What, are there general ways that you'd suggest as a prevention strategy in that case?
Well, generally what she should do is with her diet and with supplements have a functional, top functional immune system so that she's not stimulating her immune system, but it's very healthy. And so if she gets infected, it'll last a day or two, and there's no real harm to the child, no harm to the formation of the brain. And so it's a different world if you just use the natural immune system and keep it healthy by using these immune health phytonutrients. That's the best way. The natural infection is not near as harmful to the brain as stimulation, because what we have with stimulation, for instance, with vaccines, is the adjuvant, and that's what produces the immune stimulation, is aluminum. And we find the brain level of aluminum in these children is enormously high, and it stays there for a lifetime. And it produces constant immune stimulation of the brain. And the aluminum is toxic itself. And so you've got two things. You've got it's stimulating immunity, and it's a toxic metal, and it accumulates in the brain. Well, it accumulates from their diet. It accumulates from many things that they're doing. Is they'll have high aluminum, and it just keeps accumulating through life, and so they end up with a lot of neurological dysfunction.
Earlier, we had that conversation about the aluminum, particularly in the measles vaccines and the effect of that. And I'll put the link to that video in the description so viewers can check that out, Dr. Blaylock. Earlier, we were talking about these foods that RFK Jr. has targeted, like the red dyes, the additives, and the seed oils that pose a toxicity risk. Beyond those, what else would you like to see RFK Jr. focus on in terms of dealing with this food crisis in America?
Well, parents need to understand about the difference between natural food and processed food. They need to understand about toxic metals. They need to know what's being injected to their children. They need to know about the immunoexcitotoxicity of the vaccine process. And they need to get some truth about childhood vaccine. You know, when we grew up, we had all the childhood viruses. We had measles, mumps, chicken pox. I don't remember anybody in my school dying or getting seriously ill. So most of these things have such enormously low death rates and health problems. And you'll hear people say, oh, well, they measles and we had to put them in the hospital. They just hydrate them and then they go home. And it's because kids are very easily dehydrated from anything. It's not that they're being treated for the virus infection. The mortality of measles in the United States is far, far less than 1%. What they do is they use the death rate in Africa. And in Africa, measles has about a 30% mortality rate. Well, it's not due to the measles having that high mortality rate. The kids are infected with parasites. They have poor nutrition. And when they added nutrition to the kids, the death rate from measles fell tremendously. For instance, vitamin A, when they added zinc, the death rate fell precipitously. And see, when they treated the parasites, got rid of the parasites, the mortality from these diseases fell precipitously. And so we see that every time these people talk about mortality, they're talking about a third world country. They're not talking about the United States. For instance, hepatitis B is the lowest rate of hepatitis B in the world was the United States. And most hepatitis B goes away even if you don't treat it. So, you know, the public is being lied to about a lot of these infections. And of course, these companies are making billions of dollars off these vaccines. They keep adding them. These kids are getting something like 46 different injections before they go to school. And like I said, that's a priming effect. And you have to look at the adjuvant. It's not the measles virus or a dead virus you put in the vaccine. It's the adjuvant that's the harmful thing. They don't test it for safety. And if a kid goes to the pediatrician, they get 7 or 8 vaccines at once. Well, that's 7 or 8 doses of aluminum. Each one is in excess of the safety level for aluminum for an adult. And they've had 8 or 9 different injections of aluminum that goes in their brain and their body and stays there. And then they, 4 or 5 years later, they go to school, to high school or college. They get vaccinated again. They get more aluminum. So we need some truth in telling about these things and what we know about them. And we're not getting that. We're getting a pack of lies from people that are working hand in foot with these pharmaceutical companies and making billions. They're making billions off of this.
In a moment, we'll hear about the toxicity factor in pesticides. The unexpected places that it's showing up will certainly surprise you. First, though, studies of supernutrient NMN suggest it could protect against brain cell damage and reduce cognitive decline. I spoke to Dr. Jingduan Yang about the controversy surrounding this promising supplement. Here's a quick look.
Recently, FDA has banned the NMN sold as a supplement.
This triggered no small outcry among those seeking to evade the ravages of age through NMN or stave off disease through its myriad reported health benefits.
This will improve mitochondrial function, metabolic function, it protects the cardiovascular system, and it also potentially protects the nervous system.
What changes are seen in kidney function and other metrics for age? What dosage of NMN brings the optimal health benefit? And why has another potentially super nutrient been banned? Afterward, find the link to that video at the top of the comments and also in this video's description below. Subscribe for full access to our ever-expanding insight on fine-tuning your health. Just hit the big red button below. We've talked about many different things that can contribute to inflammation, the toxicity in the brain that could lead on to diseases like autism, ADHD. We've talked about meat, we've talked about the gluten in bread, chicken tenders, we've looked at vaccinations. Is there anything else that you'd add to this list of major toxic factors?
Oh, the pesticides and herbicides would be one that a lot of these people are exposed to it. And I think one of the big problems of chronic disease is exposure to pesticides and herbicides. For instance, Roundup is everywhere. And they've looked at the Roundup in drinking water. They looked at it in people's body. They've looked at it in amniotic fluid in pregnant women. They find glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. And now they say it's everywhere. It's all over the planet. It's in food, it's in water, it's in trees, it's in the vegetables, it's in meats. I mean, it's the contamination with pesticides is a big problem. If you smell them, as I've put in several of my newsletters, as the olfactory nerve transmits these pesticides into the brain and produces brain damage. We're buying a considerable amount of food from foreign countries, and they use pesticides that are banned in this country. Banned because they cause a cancer or they're neurodestructive, but they're not banned in these countries. And they're allowed to import them. Only 1% of imported foods are even inspected by the FDA. And so these kids and adults are exposed to pesticides in their foods that are extremely dangerous. Heavy metals, many things like mercury and aluminum and lead and arsenic, we're finding in the foods.
With the glyphosate, I understand, is a major issue with the pesticides. Is there a glutamate factor involved with the glyphosate as well?
Well, the glyphosate can stimulate excitotoxicity in the brain. And one of the things we didn't cover is we thought in the beginning that the glutamate receptors were just in the nervous system. Now we found out that glutamate receptors are in every organ. Liver, pancreas, lungs, intestines are covered in glutamate receptors. Well, there's no filter for that. So anything you eat activates those receptors. You can produce diabetes in animals with glutamate. And so you can produce the lung destruction we see with COVID. I wrote an article about that, excitotoxicity in the lungs as a cause of the cytokine storm. And so we know about these things, but unfortunately, the vast majority of doctors have never even heard of it. They don't know anything about excitotoxicity. There's a tremendous amount of excitotoxicity that can go on in the heart when the heart is damaged. It's an electrical organ. The electricity through the electrical nerves in the heart are glutamate controlled. And so glutamate can cause arrhythmias, abnormal heartbeats, destruction of the heart, damage to the heart muscle. It can cause vasospasm of the coronary arteries. So all your arteries are controlled by electrical impulses. And that can also be triggered by excitotoxicity. So we see the expanse of this is enormous.
Is it that you have a certain amount of glutamate in your body to regulate these different processes, like the biorhythms, like the functioning of the heart, but through the diet, through this immunoexcitotoxicity, you have an excess of glutamate, which is throwing those processes out of balance? Is that roughly the idea?
Yeah, I mean, they're very low levels of glutamate to operate these nerves. And when you consume glutamate in food, in processed food, the glutamate goes sky high. And like I said, outside of the cell, it's enormously toxic. And inflammation prevents it from being transferred back into the cell. I mean, it's a very complicated, complex set of reactions that has to do with the control of glutamate, and all that's being altered by inflammation. So there's this tremendous interaction that's going on that people don't know that these processed foods are interfering with.
Thank you so much for coming on to Vital Signs again, Dr. Blaylock, and highlighting how the things that go into our bodies, the link that this has to these diseases that are presenting, like autism, ADHD, and schizophrenia. It's important for people to understand that link so they can take the appropriate preventative steps. And we'll see how successful RFK Jr. is in targeting particularly these foods that are causing this inflammation factor, this toxicity factor. I look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
You're welcome, and I certainly appreciate it.
We've learned how everything from the meat, cheese, and chicken tenders we eat to the aluminum adjuvant in vaccines and glyphosate in pesticides can trigger inflammation in the brain. Dr. Blaylock speaks about foods targeted by RFK Jr. like seed oils, dyes, and flavorings, and the link to conditions like autism in part 1 of this series. Here's a quick look.
The dyes that they use for these children, like red dye number 5, is associated with cancer and neurobehavioral problems.
The gluten and gliadin, which are associated with wheat, where do you see this fitting in the toxicity scale?
When the gut gets inflamed, if you're eating these foods and the gut's inflamed, it inflames the brain within minutes. And if you keep eating them, if you're eating them every day for years, your brain stays inflamed. And with autism, they found out that the microglia was not only activated in the child, but even 40 years later, the microglia was still activated.
The link to that and also my look at controversial anti-aging supernutrient, NMN, are both at the top of the comments and in the description below. Also there you'll find the link to Dr. Blaylock's The Blaylock Wellness Report. With that said, it's been great to be with you. I'm Brendan Fallon, and this is Vital Signs.